Now, something else I want to be able to convey today is that in a modern GIS, in a GIS where we have things that we're doing to share outside of just our organization or just outside of a single desktop machine, there will always be some degree of compromise on security. Security is not about, whacking you on the hand to say, well, you aren't doing this, that's secure, you're not doing that. You need to understand that security is not going to be a perfect thing every single time. You won't always be able to understand every threat, and you won't always be able to take every possible security best practice in your organization. So the last takeaway that I want to actually start with is that security, as I like to define it, is a lot more than just cyber attacks. We're not just talking about ransomware or major hacking as we like to think of it typically. We're talking about a lot more than just that. We're talking about the ability to keep your organization up and running and to maintain and protect the valuable data that you have in your GIS. So I want to start with that. We often see headlines that ultimately come down to some sort of security, and whether it's in state and local government, like where I work, or in private business, or even with individuals. When headlines mention the catastrophic things that can happen to our systems, they tend to involve dollar signs and public outrage. So we might see something about a leak, a hack, something where someone came into your system and compromised improperly and was able to provide to others or keep for themselves sensitive data. We may also see things like outages that were either unintentional or intentional, such as with a distributed denial of service attack or a DDoS. With a DDoS, you have often a coordinated group of machines throwing a lot of requests at a website and essentially forcing it to go down. The outages that we see, whether it's intentional or unintentional, can really cause havoc in our systems and in the databases and websites that we rely on. We also see a lot of times issues that might be considered embezzlement or fraud or betrayal of trust in organizational GIS, where someone in a privileged position, someone with who has access, is doing something that they shouldn't be. And particularly when a system is not well monitored, those intentional threats to data authority and to the consistency of our data can be really catastrophic. We also may see things, kind of the flip side of that compromise of data, where they're unintentional, where we have someone who did not mean to be editing the authoritative data set or the default version, or working in the production website and didn't realize that they were doing something that changed data that may not be able to be recovered. Each of those three axes is something that we call in the security world the CIA Triad: confidentiality, availability, and integrity. So when we're talking about leaks, we talk about confidentiality, improper access that betray the secrecy and safety of the data and the resources that we have. When we talk about outages and disruptions, we are referring to attacks on our assets, our operations, and the uptime that we have in our systems. We talk about improper access or improper editing or modifying, whether it's intentional or unintentional. We're talking about a loss of authority of our data, a loss of integrity in being able to ensure that the data that we have is the authoritative one, and that will not be improperly modified. So the CIA Triad is a way of thinking about the different dimensions of security, the different dimensions of what we're trying to protect in our organizations and in our GIS. With confidentiality, the key for us is to be able to stay aware of who has access to what in our system, whether it's the data level at the application level, who is able to view what is sensitive data, particularly sensitive data that's protected by standards such as HIPAA, or personally identifiable information, credit card information. Is that data being kept confidential? With integrity, we're thinking about how to prevent improper changes to our content, particularly in a way that betrays trust or takes advantage of someone's privilege within an organization, within a system, in order to do something to change or modify data for either unintentionally or intentionally to achieve some sort of end. And with availability, we're hoping to keep our sites continuously operating. And the aspect of security there is to be able to minimize the downtime and the data loss. First, being able to hopefully prevent a disaster from occurring, but knowing that when disaster is inevitable, being prepared on how we're going to minimize the amount of downtime the system experiences, and then how we're going to minimize the data that gets lost when a disaster, if and when a disaster, of course, will occur. So these are different elements, but they all pertain to security. And in the real world, in an organization, we often have these trade-offs that we have to consider with each of them. We cannot keep a system guarantee confidentiality, integrity, and availability because we have work to do, because we have limited resources to accomplish what we're doing. We have a lot of things to get done, and we have people with whom we need to share our GIS resources. So with confidentiality, we do have to be able to provide some level of access to data, and it's not going to be perfect. The best way to keep something secure is to never expose it, is to keep it offline, is to never allow people to view the data, to never be able to access our internal machines. But we will have to trade off at some point and reasonably, rationally allow access to our systems. When we have many editors doing many things in an organization, we will eventually have some sort of issue where data gets improperly modified. Whether the person intended to or not, we will have to be able to allow people to have access to edit our data and to, at some point, potentially risk the authority and the integrity of our data in the system. And we don't always have the ability to preserve uptime. Some of you may be familiar with the concepts of high availability and disaster recovery, which are methods to try and protect your system from disaster, to be able to protect in the event of a disaster, to have a separate system that you can fail over to that replicates all of your data, or that a machine that's able to be spun up or transferred to when the first machine goes down. However, high availability and disaster recovery can be really expensive to implement. You may not have the number of machines and the amount of administrative time and effort that it takes to implement what might be considered a fully disaster-proof, fault-tolerant system. And so you may have to make compromises and limit, allow a limited amount of downtime and a limited amount of data loss that is acceptable for your organization and your work, in order to work with what you have and the limited resources and time and effort that's available to you. So I like to make sure, and going back all the way to the beginning, security can be seen as a very dense, topic with a lot of jargon. I like to limit the amount of jargon that I use, but I will have to use a little bit. So I want to get the jargon out of the way and help to define what I'm talking about when it comes to security in ArcGIS. So the first term that I want to get across and define is defense in depth. Defense in depth might also be called the layer cake approach, but it's about understanding that a single barrier may not always be adequate. When we have a well-defined security strategy in organization, we're adding multiple levels of security. That means that we have layers that can protect our organization if a different method falls through. So for example, when you have a firewall in an organization, a firewall can be either a hardware firewall or a software firewall. There are advantages to using both of them. A hardware firewall is probably what most of us are familiar with, but adding a firewall at the software level is a way to add additional protection against certain requests that are coming into the system. So when you define a software firewall, a web application firewall, or a different type, you're adding an extra layer of security, and it's not intended to replace a hardware firewall where you're literally putting, what ports on a computer can be accessed, but adding in a second method and hopefully additional methods will protect you in the case that one layer is breached or is inadequate to protect you against a certain cyber attack or an improper method of use. The next set of terms I want to define is related to security posture. How security posture is the sum total of all the tools and methods and policies and procedures that we take in order to control our system security. Posture is about understanding the complete amount of potential risk and vulnerability we might have. With the term of posture also comes the related term of attack surface. The attack surface is all of the different ways in which we might be vulnerable to an attack. It's the resources that we have put online, or at least outside of a single machine, the amount of exposure that we're given, whether something might be, if a resource is publicly accessible, that might increase the attack surface. But we also might have a resource that is technically publicly accessible, but is not shared anywhere. That kind of exposure affects our attack surface. The attack surface also understands what threats might come into play, what different types of resources we're exposing, and what the current threat landscape is out there. Many of you may have heard of the Log4j vulnerability that was exposed last December. The Log4j threat vulnerability is such a serious one because it is a new type of attack surface. Rather than being able to be shut down by traditional methods of requiring authentication into a resource, the Log4j threat is that it could potentially bypass any sort of software authentication that you have in place. The attack surface is really important to understand and to quantify when you're thinking about your security. And if something doesn't need to be opened up on the attack surface, perhaps an older map that is no longer being used is still made secure or unsecure, is still made public, perhaps making that secured or taking that down will remove the unnecessary element and therefore harden your security posture, reduce your attack surface by, again, understanding where the trade-off is in your overall security approach. With the concept of posture, we also have the considerations to think about of isolation, of how we are exposing our different systems and whether those different systems talk to each other. Isolation is getting a lot of trend in the IT world, especially with the idea of containers. And containers can take a lot of different forms, and it's more of a concept that's for a larger discussion. But the idea of containerizing a system means that you're putting everything in an isolated container, a box where it is able to be contained, to be quarantined and removed from service if something were to happen to that container. The term of containerization often refers to the ability to quarantine off a certain service and spin up a new one in its place when that goes down, in the event of a disaster, but it also applies in the security standpoint. If I have a system, if I have one machine that gets breached, someone gains improper access to that machine, how much are they also able to access? Are they able to get to the other machines on my network? Are they able through getting access to one data set or one GIS portal to access all the rest of my machines, all the rest of my systems, and all the rest of my data? Isolation is about both protecting, both either physically or digitally, logically, the separation of my different elements of my system. But it's also being able to contain those different elements if something does get impacted. And along with the idea of isolation is the idea of least privilege, where I'm giving only the amount of privilege to each user of my system, only the privileges that they need to get their work done. If someone has access to every single data set in my system, if their credentials get stolen or their identity is hacked, or God forbid, if they decide to betray the organization, the more access they have and the less isolation the system has, the more potential damage they can do and the wider attack surface they might have in my GIS. The last term I want to talk about is enforcement and the idea of controls. When I'm enforcing the policies that I have, and I have written up some great policies, and I know exactly how I, as an administrator, want to keep my organization secure, I also have to have ways of enforcing those rules. We often rely on administrative controls where someone in the organization is reviewing everything that's happening and is perhaps being the gatekeeper who says whether something can be done, whether a resource can go public or not. But that isn't always going to prevent improper exposure of resources, improper access to resources. And so administrative controls where a human is making a decision and either allowing or disallowing something to occur shouldn't be the only mechanism that you have in your system of enforcement. That's why we like to make sure that our security systems in ArcGIS allow technical controls on your system. The ability to detect when someone is accessing something that they shouldn't, and to immediately prevent them from having access. Now, while I'll admit that Esri has some ability to provide technical controls, but more and more we're seeing some really powerful third-party tools in the IT security world to allow technical enforcement of your policies. And it's often referring to tools that are using artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms that are able to quickly learn a new pattern of behavior that might be considered dangerous, and then to prevent users to adapt how it's allowing access into a system to then prevent that behavior from being allowed, being supported. So technical controls, I think, will only continue to increase in the next 5 to 10 years. And your IT team is probably thinking quite hard about what kind of controls and what third-party software can be implemented in order to provide that immediate and effective automated control and dynamic learning of what to protect against in your system. So now, having defined all of that, I want to talk about the elements of security in ArcGIS. It is a very wide range of things that we can talk about, and truly could take a whole semester to understand security in ArcGIS systems, particularly in ArcGIS Online and Enterprise, the WebGIS content that we continue to build and grow. But security contains everything from who has the lock, who has the key to get into the room where your server is kept, all the way up to what apps do you have and what sharing settings are for those apps. So I want to focus today just on the top 4 elements of the system. Data, the actual physical data and the data sets and relations that they have among data sets and databases. Identities, meaning the users in your system and what roles and privileges they're given. the services that you have on your ArcGIS server or on Esri's ArcGIS Online servers, and then the content that you're serving out, controlling, sharing, and allowing people to contribute to. So let's talk about secure data in GIS. We have, particularly in the Esri paradigm, we have two kind of types of data. We have data that is user managed. That might be on a file geo database, a mobile geo database, might be in Excel spreadsheets, might be in Microsoft Access, or in the more formal enterprise geo databases, a small E enterprise, SQL Server, Oracle, Datamix, things like that. And then we have ArcGIS managed data. We often use the term hosted when we talk about hosted or ArcGIS managed data, but it's living in the ArcGIS data store or hosted in ArcGIS Online. And both types of data have different ways to be kept secure. But in particular, there's more to understand and more that falls on the user in terms of responsibility to secure user managed data. It's important to understand what Esri already does to protect and secure hosted data as well. So the first thing to understand with data is, as I said before, to take an inventory and understand the level of sensitivity of each data set you have, particularly when you are responsible for maintaining and adhering to standards such as HIPAA and GDPR and other standards that are around. This involves the level of data classification. And data classification is an important task to take for all types of your data, regardless of where it's living. Understanding the difference between data that can be freely disclosed to the public and presents no security risk, no risk of identity theft or fraud, no risk of lawsuits if something were to be improperly accessed. There's a spectrum all the way down to restricted data, highly sensitive data that if it is compromised will present extreme risk or liability to the organization that's hosting it. Understanding and explicitly defining the level of classification that each data set in your purview has is a really important step. And that goes along with every GIS professional's favorite thing, which is metadata. I know that we all love to spend our day defining, writing down, cleaning up, and standardizing metadata, but it is really important, and it really does pertain to security. If we are able to put in our metadata for each of our layers and data sets and items, the explicit and understandable and standardized information about the sensitivity of a data set, the value of a data set, the intended audience of who should see it and who needs to be able to access it, and whether the data set is considered to be authoritative or complete. That metadata can really help improve our security posture and provide full information to everyone who's able to look at the metadata item and help with that security. So a security best practice is to be able to define in your organization and automate wherever possible the creation, updating, and viewing of metadata at the data item level. When it comes to data encryption, there are several things to understand, and in particular, the data encryption at rest is a really advanced topic that has a lot of different options. The data encryption is preventing usability of data that is improperly accessed. Even if I am able to gain access to a particular data set, am I able to then, as a human, easily read the data that I've gotten access to? That can be determined by whether or not the data is encrypted. There are three states of data that pertain to data encryption. When data is sitting in a database and not currently being used or transferred, it's considered at rest. And the amount of different encryption methods for data at rest are definitely outside of the scope of what I'm talking about today. But it's important to understand that in ArcGIS Online, we use a type of encryption, TDE, or transparent disk encryption or data encryption that is intended to protect and encrypt all data at rest. And it's highly encouraged that your database administrators or whoever's maintaining your data understand how to protect your data when it's at rest through encryption. I do want to talk about the next state in more detail, which is data in transit. Data that is being transferred from its point of rest to where it's going to be used. And with data in transit, that's when we talk about different transfer protocols that we have in our web browsers. The last form of data encryption is encryption in use. And when data has fully been given to perhaps I'm on a web page or I've received it on a flash drive or whatever it is, and I'm now looking at the data that I've received. Data in use is harder to define and control at an organizational level, but it involves things like making sure, physically no one's looking over your shoulder, making sure that you don't download, you're not allowing users who receive data to download copies in plain text of the data that they receive if they're not intended to have complete access from now on to that data. So being able to share data without allowing download is a way that we allow data to be protected and encrypted when in use. So let's talk about that middle encryption type of the state of data in transit. Well, most often when we are serving out data, we're doing so over the internet, over the TCP/IP and HTTP protocols. And that involves some key decisions to make as an organization when it comes to the protocols that we're allowing to be used over the internet. Most of you have probably heard of HTTP, of Hypertext Transfer Protocol. It's foundational to the concept of the World Wide Web. And hopefully you know that there is an extra layer of protection with the protocol of HTTPS. HTTPS is common, is pretty much ubiquitous these days. It is pretty hard to find a website that is not using HTTPS. But you should know that it is still very important and is still a very common way of gaining improper access to unencrypted data takes place by gaining access in an HTTP website or by doing something called a downgrade of a website from HTTPS to HTTP. The SSL or TLS protocol, and again, I'm not trying to do jargon, but HTTPS uses different protocols to encrypt the data that is being transferred on a website. And HTTPS is a way of ensuring that data will arrive encrypted, of essentially establishing a secured partnership, a trust between the client and the server, and to maintain that encryption throughout the life cycle of the session has been established. In ArcGIS, we've made a lot of strides in the last few years to enforce HTTPS and to make sure that whenever possible, HTTPS is being used over HTTP. In your browser, you tend to see nowadays, you'll see a padlock and often green HTTPS when a website is verified by the browser to be secure. HTTPS is able to protect against the sniffing of networks and if data does happen to be intercepted or you are somehow fooled into providing data, that data is maintained as encrypted. We also have the extra ability to do HSTS, which is a different option. It's called strict transport security, which protects the ability or prevents the ability of a request to downgrade from HTTPS to HTTP if a bad actor is indeed trying to do that type of cyber attack. We recommend that you enable HSTS in ArcGIS Server and ArcGIS Portal. And in the last few years, we have required that in ArcGIS Online, all traffic take place over HTTPS. In ArcGIS Enterprise, we now require by default, when you establish your site, that HTTPS only be the default protocol allowed. But you can also, if you choose to, you can disable this and allow access to take place over HTTP as well as HTTPS. We also do, for the server, as I mentioned, offer that extra HSTS protocol. I would highly encourage that you never click that button, that you always maintain HTTPS only as the default protocol. And if you are able to have your administrator, or if you are the administrator, research and consider enabling HSTS to maintain that data encryption. For those of you who are trying to still understand the differences in data encryption and the uses for different types of data options within ArcGIS, I highly recommend that you Google this white paper. And if someone has access to the link, please put it in the chat. This is an excellent white paper that is more so about content and different workflows than about security, but is really helpful in helping you understand the different types of referenced or user managed and hosted and ArcGIS managed data that exist in an ArcGIS system and that help you understand exactly when to use what. So for a security best practice, whether you do have user managed or ArcGIS managed, and most organizations have some combination of the two, understand when and how to encrypt your data, both at rest and in transit, and to ensure that when data is in use, that common sense methods are followed. Particularly when a data set is considered to be sensitive and highly liable to risk if it were to be unencrypted and exposed and put in the wrong hands. Next, I want to talk about the level of identity. Identity refers to the people that use our system and to where identities are managed, where the information about a user's particular identity is managed, how long and how many different systems a different identity is maintained, where the credentials that a user uses to sign into that identity are kept, and also about the actual act of authenticating a user, proving that someone is who they say they are, and then authorizing the identity, which is saying, now that I've authenticated someone and they have verified that they are who they say they are, I'm going to give them privileges and access to the things that they're authorized to access based on that identity. So within the concepts of identity, we have an identity store. Identity stores are something that maintains information about identities. In order to access a certain resource, that resource will often look to its identity store to understand, to do the work of authenticating, authorizing the user. We see a lot of different types of identity stores and we interact with them all the time. Many of us have password managers, or hopefully we've been moving away from spreadsheets that have all of our passwords. But each of those things is an identity store. Each of those is a credential that we have for a certain identity in an identity store somewhere outside of our network. Typically, or traditionally, we have all these different identity stores where I log into my operating system, then I log into my email, I log into any sort of messenger that I might have. I log into, Target.com and Walmart.com. I log into my work systems. I log into my databases. Of course, maintaining all these different identities can be quite a pain. And so more recently, we've seen a lot of enablement of linking accounts where I have a single workplace account. Often that's Microsoft 365 or my integrated Windows account. When I log into my operating system, I don't then have to also log into email and log into the workplace chat and log into the different business systems that I use at work. And in ArcGIS, we also have the identity stores now where when I'm logged into one ArcGIS platform or app, I am then having that identity persist across different apps and different workflows that I might need to do, because that's all maintained in a ArcGIS identity store. Now, in the context of ArcGIS, that continues to offer certain options. And we may have identity stores that are maintained by ArcGIS, such as when I'm signing in to my portal and I have a set of credentials, a username and password that are maintained only within the ArcGIS system. And while they do provide me the option to do different things within ArcGIS, they don't pertain to anything outside of my GIS system. Or we have more frequently or more commonly in recent years seen the transition to enterprise, and again, that's a small e enterprise, single sign-on, or enterprise identity providers. These look different, and there are some protocols that each enterprise identity provider might use in common, but they all are essentially a partnership between the different business systems of your workplace or your organization to provide a single login, a single sign-in experience, and a single process, a single act of authentication and authorization that is maintained by the organization to give you a single sign-in. With a single sign-on platform, you are able to sign in to ArcGIS and your timesheet and your email and your database with the single sign-on credential. I'm sure many of you are using at work, you have some sort of enterprise single sign-on. It might be Active Directory or Okta or Google Suite, but these provide a lot of important functions. They centralize the access control by giving you a single set of credentials that applies across all the work that you do and all the systems that you interact with. But they also do provide a single entry point for all resources, which can be an increased risk. And I'll talk about that in a second. Single sign-on facilitates the dynamic user profile, where if my job changes, all my privileges can be changed through one store, rather than having each different business system need updating in order to say, well, this person's now a different job, or this person's left the company. We need to do 20 different things to revoke their access. With dynamic single sign-on profiling, I can have a single set of privileges be revoked or changed based on my job. It also solves the remote location problem of having members need to access the resources from anywhere. It allows me to be able to sign into my systems no matter where I am, no matter what device I'm on. And it aligns the security practices and gives your IT greater control and access over everything, over all kinds of authentication and authorization across your organization. Now, the downside of enterprise single sign-on, or the increased risks that it poses, is in the fact that it is providing a single point of entry. More so than in previous times, perhaps 10 years ago, we might have thought of security as being really important to control our firewall or control who gets into the building and is able to log in or get into our Ethernet system. Now, security is principally concerned with identity, verifying and protecting someone's identity, and making sure that that the ability to spoof someone's identity is prevented or protected against as much as possible. When credentials are leaked or stolen or phished, that is really bad news. The more access you're given with that one set of credentials. So that means that relying on a single username and password that you use or might use all over, having your Facebook password be the same as your work password, that is inadequate protection. So being able to distinguish a valid from an inadequate login often means that organizations are increasing scrutiny of their authentication. This might look like a multi-factor authentication method, where I have another layer of defense when I log in. Each time I log in, I'm sure many of us do this every day, you receive a push notification on your phone, being able to verify who you are through what you have in your hand. It might be a key, a hardware key that you plug into your computer. It might be something about who you are, like your fingerprint or your face, or it might be something that you know, in addition to what your password is, but being able to say that I also know this PIN that I've received, or I'm also able to answer the security question. Having multiple ways and multiple layers of protection against identity theft and identity spoofing is really important and really critical as we continue to increase the amount of access we give through a single login. In ArcGIS, we now support the ability to have multi-factor authentication. This requires either in the portal or the ArcGIS Online that the administrator enable this, and then it is optional for every user in the organization when they sign in to enable multi-factor authentication. It's also important to think about anonymous access in ArcGIS Online and ArcGIS Enterprise portal. Can someone gain access to your system, the basics of your system, those first 5 tabs on the right or on the left of the screenshot? Are they able to even view elements of my organization, understand that I have a certain portal URL that I'm able to get to? Or do I want to challenge them for a login before they even view the basics of my WebGIS? We do recommend that you disable anonymous access by default, but we also understand that you may have reasons to allow people who do not have an identity in your system to access the basics of your content and to view your portal or your ArcGIS Online organization. Again, that is a compromise and a trade-off that you need to consider between security and access. So that might come into play. Say that you have a contractor who's coming in, or you have a visitor or an intern, someone who's not part of your identity provider, who doesn't deserve or need a full-time permanent login, but does need some level of access. But another way that we can think about, rather than just gaining or enabling anonymous access, is to consider integrating an enterprise single sign-on system that uses a certain type of protocol. So typically, you have the choice to either allow ArcGIS to maintain its own identity store, where I have a set of credentials for my portal or my ArcGIS Online, or to use an enterprise identity store, such as with Active Directory, where I completely give control over my ArcGIS logins to that enterprise single sign-on system. The newer way of enabling kind of that hybrid approach is to use a SAML-based identity provider. Sorry, again, that's a piece of jargon, but security association markup language is a protocol that many identity providers use that has a very standardized format of doing its authentication and authorization. When you enable a SAML